Okay, sorry. Jazakallah khair, Sister Farisa. I'm just going to pick up. They filled the proclamation with Islamic concepts just to satisfy the scholars to make sure that no religious rebellion happened. So they Islamified the whole thing. One major reform that was happening was that they're making all the subjects equal under the legal system. There was no more difference between Muslim and non-Muslims or stuff like that. They also placed less emphasis on the Sharia courts for a more secular version. Even though Islam became less important, it was never removed like the French removed the Catholic Church. So it was still, Islam played a role, but they kind of made it less important. And you'll notice a common trend in Ottoman history. They'll first oppose reform, and then they'll make fake reforms to make it look like they're reforming, and then they'll be forced to make real reforms. So at first, and then their cycle would repeat when like someone is like, oh, you're reforming too much, let's go back to the old ways, right? And one of the biggest people that the Ottomans wanted to please was Britain. They were by far the biggest ally. They were by far the biggest ally in Europe. They were even willing to give up, the Ottomans were willing to give up provinces to keep Britain as an ally. And Britain, they felt the same way towards the Ottomans, but they kind of saw the Ottomans as a way to stop the Russians. So the British did find the Ottomans as allies. And one important thing to note is that the British started to have a rise in Ottoman culture in Britain. This is a house built in Britain during this time. Looks just like a masjid. And some of you might, but the British would use the Ottomans as a tool to stop the Russians. You'll see in a couple of minutes. Some of you might ask what happened to the Austrians. Well, in earlier in my sessions, the Austrians were just this big, huge empire, probably like the most important empire in Europe, in some time. Just like the Ottomans, they were kind of the same. They started at the same time as the Ottomans, and now they're declining just like the Ottomans. So the Ottomans saw them as people they should have good relationships, but not too far. Same thing with France, just be their friends. But one thing was very clear. The Ottomans and the Russians were very much against each other. And it was Russia who first famously referred to the Ottomans as the sick man of Europe. They were trying to rally Europe against the Ottomans, but screwed up so much. It was like sad how bad they did. Britain obviously didn't agree because they're allies. Austria would rather have Ottomans in control than the Russians, so they stayed with the Ottomans. And the Russians didn't stop there. They tried to get the Ottomans to sign a treaty that was so bad. So, like, obviously the Ottomans refused, and France helped the Ottomans. So this is like the entirety of Europe is like helping the Ottomans against the Russians at this point. A lot happened in the following years. Things escalated. The British and the French joined the Ottomans against Russia, which became the largest war since the Napoleonic Wars. Right, it became the largest war since the Napoleonic Wars. The main front was Crimea. That's where all the action was happening. So this is like right here is this picture. This is a very confusing picture, but the best one I found. So this small box is this entire thing, and this small box is this entire thing. So it's right under Ukraine. This is Crimea. Right, so the main action was going on in Europe and Crimea, but the war was everywhere. It lasted like 2 whole years, and the Russians ended up backing out because they were scared the Austrians would join. So this ended up as a victory for the Ottoman side. And I think it's very important to go over the consequences of the war, the good and the bad and everything like that. They won, so yay. It wasn't really that big of a victory because it was actually more like the British and the French won, and they were just helping the Ottomans. But it did show the diplomatic strength of the Ottomans, at least for now. This is actually all of them. You'll see the Sultan is all the way back here. They were really good diplomats in the war, so that showed the Ottomans for that. They were also able to maneuver in like really tricky situations in terms of the war, I guess. It also made them a member of the European stage, which the Ottomans wanted really badly. And this sentiment of wanting to be part of Europe was a key trait of the Ottomans and later Turkey up until recently. So they keep trying to join the, Europe until very recently. But bad came out of this good too. British public started worrying less about the Russians, and Ottoman hatred resurfaced. Many people did not like seeing Britain defend the Mohammedans, what they used to call Muslims for a very long time up here. This is about India, but it still applies. They were also starting, Britain and the Ottomans were starting to see more conflicts in Arabia. Britain was still their best option. This is the Sykes-Picot agreement. This is like a whole century later, but you kind of still see they're starting to move up closer into Ottoman lands. But Britain was still their best option, even though they weren't that much support. The French did not support them nearly as much, and Austria was also declining. Germany was like a band-aid to this problem at this point. They were kind of just temporarily fixing it. And finally, Britain was, let's face it, the only ones that were going to be able to hold back the Russians. We're still in what the scholars call the Tanzimat era, where the Ottomans, more specifically Istanbul, have now become the center of European foreign policy and domestic policy. So like Istanbul during this time became so much more important than before. So like the total Ottoman importance was down, but Istanbul had way more importance. And there were many factions in the Ottoman government, each to support their own respective countries. So you'll have people in the Ottoman government who support the British, people who support the French, and people who support the Russians. And the British was obviously the strongest, and the Russians were obviously weakest, both for obvious reasons. But the Russians, surprisingly, were the strongest between like 1871 and 1875, which is the timeline we're at right now. And we'll start seeing Europe, or European powers, get really impatient with the pace of Ottoman reforms. They didn't understand that they were asking way too much for the Muslim empire. And that, combined with a lot of revolts in the Ottomans, it caused even further slip into decline. One very important and key idea to understand about the Tanzimat was their main goal was to centralize the Ottomans. And that was directly contradicting their other principles. So on like one hand, their main goal was to centralize, and the other was to let local provinces rule. So like those two don't even come close to each other. They also had to give autonomy, or they had to give independence to different places around the government to bring more power into the government. So it's like sacrificing, they had to sacrifice some stuff. And that was one of the many problems faced by these people. The Tanzimat refers to the statesmen, like the Congress of the United States, if that makes sense. The Tanzimat also changed the Ottoman mindset, or how they viewed uncivilized people. And they not to use derogatory language or to shame them, but there were many communities that were resistant to centralization. And the Ottomans in the 15th and 16th century, like Sultan Mehmed and Sultan Suleiman, they praised that. They loved that, they're doing their own thing. And then now, when they started to reform, they viewed some communities as second class, but it was also just like they were confused on why they just won't follow the Ottomans, which was, it caused an underlying, like it was bad for them. They made ambitious reform. Then when they realized why it wouldn't work, it would be followed by kind of like failure and retreats. So sounds weird, but we can look at taxes. Really boring, but you'll see the point. They wanted to ambitiously make all farm taxes equal, 1/10 of their produce. So all the taxes on like agriculture or farming stuff, you'd have to pay 1/10 of your produce. And it wouldn't take it wouldn't take too much to talk about why it wouldn't work. And it would take too much to talk about why it wouldn't work because it's complicated economic stuff. But it didn't work, and they ended up taking the reform back. Also, they symbolically changed the jizya, the same amount, but under a different name. So while it wasn't changed, it was like a big leap in trying to westernized the Khilafah. That was successful. So not all of them failed. They even tried to, and actually succeeded, in establishing banks. Establishing banks through the empire. They issued paper money, which was loaned with interest, but that never caught up with people outside of major cities. The paper money, they still used coins and stuff like that. And even with this, their money wasn't doing good at all. They kept debasing their coins, the debt was soaring, they didn't have a lot of investment. All this caused the Ottomans to decline even further. And this culminated into the Ottomans defaulting, or like they say, we can't do it, we can't pay this anymore, on the interest of foreign debt. Not even the debt in general, just the interest of the debt. And this caused like an outcry so large throughout Europe, so large just throughout Europe. People insulting ambassadors was common. Many people stopped seeing a reason for the Ottomans to exist. Public opinion plummeted. And while we're on the subject of economy, we could talk about industrialization, which made Europe, I guess, less mad a little bit, but they were still really, really mad. The Ottomans tried, some more than others. And when I say that, I'm talking about the Ottoman provinces. So some provinces, because they were still pretty independent, some tried more than others. Egypt. Egypt was effectively its own government, which under Mehmet Ali tried really hard to industrialize early. The Tanzimat were later in the next century and trying to industrialize. So this guy, he sees industrialization and how it's making them rich, Europe rich. So he's like, why don't we do this too? So he sets up factories and stuff like that. And later, so he comes before the Tanzimat, which is what we're talking about right now. The Tanzimat is just the era that people classify. So the Tanzimat come and try, but they inevitably fail. And with all these economic fails, the public was about to rise. But in the beginning, they kind of controlled the newspaper only at first, so people didn't really hear much about it until more were created. Some were sponsored by the government, so they didn't really criticize the government. Others were, just cause. Those were created just cause claimed to be the voice of the people, and they would criticize the governments. And what do most governments do when they're criticized? They censor. And this isn't like political, but everyone, all empires did it. They would it wasn't anything new of censoring. But the people still heard about this, and they started to become more and more mad at the Ottomans, and they started to look more and more towards Europe, especially you'll see in European literature. Poems and books were translated into Turkish, and for the bulk of the later half of the 19th century, so like from 1850 to like 1900s, this was something only the upper class would do. Read poems and books, or European poems and books that were translated into Turkish. But towards the end of the century, it spread to the masses. And the final thing I'm going to talk about relating to literature during the Tanzimat is the plays and the drama. Drama became very popular. And in the beginning, it was mainly translated European plays until they started making their own plays. And this showed that very clear that their culture was still evolving. They weren't stuck in the past. So one thing that they knew, or one thing that they started to really emulate, they started to copy, was the French culture, especially French culture. I don't know why the French culture, but they really liked French culture. There's something known as à la France, which ended up being a lifestyle of trying to imitate European culture. And it would be pure madness to assume that no one felt things were going too far. It's like, hey guys, we're not Europe. Let's stop acting like Europe. And a group of these people were called the Young Ottomans, not the Young Turks. Those are different, and you'll see them much later. The Young Ottomans weren't as nearly as famous as the Young Turks, but they were before the Young Turks, and they were a pretty big deal. They published a journal that criticized the government, and they became very influential. But people started to take their nationalist ideas instead of their political ones. And that sounds complicated, but how do I explain this? So they had two big ideas. The Young Ottomans had two big ideas. The first was that the Ottomans should, or the government should be based off of Islamic principles and laws. And the second is that people should be proud of their Turkish origins and stuff like that. So people took the second point, not so much the first. Right? So people started to be like, yeah, we're Turkish, we should love that stuff. And I started to forget about, the first idea that the government should be based off of Islamic principles and laws. I started a little bit later, so I'm going to cut it off now because this is a great place to stop. I had more planned, but inshallah, I think last time I'll be able to finish everything. And inshallah, next time will be my last session. Jazakallah khair. Like I said, I'm sorry for the delay, but inshallah, I'll see you next time. Oh, sorry. Are there any questions? I completely forgot.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
I see someone talking, but hold up. Let me stop sharing because I can't hear anything.
I'm going to go down and try to get up.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. Assalamualaikum.
Okay. Thank you so much. Can you please elaborate on the tax system? You said there is something that was 10% that was imposed, and yeah, if you can just talk just a bit about it.
Yeah. So I talked about the taxes because I was talking about making big reforms. The Ottomans making big reforms. So basically, before this, or before now, the Ottomans used something like I forget what it's called, but it was a different system that they used since the beginning. It was a new system. It was really good. It was really good for the beginning. They got really rich off of that, but they kind of kept with the system until they started to make the tax reform. So basically, so they wanted to change the taxes, and another thing they wanted to do was make, equality. They wanted to push that because Europe, they wanted to see that. So they said, okay, why don't we make all farm taxes equal? So taxes for agriculture, all the stuff that you would grow and farm and produce. And that was a tenth of that. It didn't work, and they took it back. And they kind of changed the reforms, didn't make it as equal, because you can't make the agriculture tax something like that. It has to be based off of not only how much you grow, but where you grow, how many people you have, and you're supporting all that stuff. It's different for everyone. So it didn't work because they tried to go too big with it and make it like, oh, everyone is going to pay the same. Did that answer the question?
Yeah. Thank you so much. So it's a way for them to assimilate more into Europeans, right?
Yeah, it was a way to also show that, hey, look, we're doing what you kind of asked us to do, because they needed to. They needed to do that. Yeah. That was a good question. I should have elaborated more on that.
No, thank you. No, it's very clear. Thank you so much. And, I remember also Turkey was, trying to do the same, even in modern days, trying to get to the European Union. I'm not sure how adamant they are now on pursuing it.
Yeah,
but, yeah.
So I was saying that that it was up until even until Turkey, up until recently, where they tried to assimilate. And because you're right, they would try, especially with Ataturk, he tried and the people after him, they tried really hard to join the European Union, which was like the European stage. But recently they started to stop trying as much with Erdogan, the president, or I don't know if he's president or prime minister, the leader of Turkey. He kind of stopped trying as much, which I don't know, some people think it's good, some people think it's bad. Jazakallah khair. Are there any other questions? Okay. Inshallah, I'll see you next week. I know it's the second time I conclude, but Jazakallah khair and ma's salama.